The barn was already burning when Rose Patterson ran inside to save the horses, but she never imagined the entire hayloft would collapse on top of her. Flames licked up the wooden walls of the stable as black smoke poured through the rafters, and Rose could hear the terrified screaming of the animals trapped in their stalls. She had been walking back from the general store in Ellsworth, Kansas, when she saw the orange glow against the twilight sky and recognized it immediately as the old Henderson barn on the edge of town. It was May of 1878, and the spring had been unusually dry, making everything a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Rose dropped her packages and hitched up her skirts, running as fast as her legs could carry her across the dusty street. The heat hit her like a physical wall when she burst through the barn doors, but she pushed forward anyway. Her father had taught her to respect animals, to treat them with the same care and dignity as any person, and she could not stand by while living creatures burned to death. The first stall held a brown mare who was kicking frantically at the wooden gate, eyes rolling white with terror. Rose fumbled with the latch, her fingers shaking from adrenaline and fear, finally managing to swing the gate open. The mare bolted past her toward the open doors and freedom. She moved to the second stall, coughing now as the smoke grew thicker. This one held a pair of draft horses, massive beasts that towered over her small frame. Rose was only 22 years old and stood barely 5 feet tall, but she had never let her size stop her from doing what needed to be done. Her mother had died 3 years ago, and her father had passed just last winter, leaving Rose alone in the world with nothing but her determination and the small seamstress shop she ran on Main Street. She worked the latch on the second stall, and the draft horses thundered past her, their heavy hooves shaking the ground. Rose was reaching for the third stall when she heard the terrible groaning sound above her head. She looked up and saw the support beam of the hayloft beginning to give way, weakened by the flames that had eaten through its base. Time seemed to slow down as she watched it start to fall, and she tried to throw herself backward, but her boot caught on a piece of loose board. The beam came down with a crash that echoed through the burning building, and Rose felt an explosion of pain in her right leg as the massive timber pinned her to the ground. She screamed, a sound that was lost in the roar of the fire. The weight was crushing, impossible, and when she tried to pull her leg free, the pain was so intense that black spots danced in front of her eyes. She could feel the heat of the flames growing closer, could see the fire spreading across the hay-strewn floor toward her. This was how she was going to die, she realized with a strange sense of clarity. Alone, trapped, burned alive in someone else's barn while trying to save their horses. Then she heard boot falls, heavy and quick, and a figure emerged through the smoke. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the dusty canvas pants and worn leather vest of a working cowboy. His face was partially obscured by the smoke, but she could see dark eyes scanning the scene, taking in her situation with a practiced assessment. He ran toward her without hesitation, dropping to his knees beside the beam that pinned her leg. "Hold on," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Just hold on." He positioned himself beside the beam, planting his boots firmly on the ground and getting his shoulder under the massive timber. Rose watched in amazement as he began to lift, his whole body straining with the effort. The muscles in his arms and shoulders stood out like cords, and she could hear his breath coming in harsh gasps as he fought against the impossible weight. The beam lifted an inch, then 2, then 3. "Can you pull free?" he gasped, holding the beam aloft through sheer strength of will. "Try now." Rose did not waste time answering. She gritted her teeth against the pain and dragged herself backward, pulling her crushed leg out from under the timber. The moment she was clear, the cowboy let the beam drop with a crash and reached down to scoop her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He turned and ran for the barn doors, carrying her against his chest while the building collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks and burning wood. They made it outside just as the roof caved in completely. The cowboy carried her a safe distance away before gently setting her down on the grass. Rose gasped for breath, her lungs burning from the smoke, her leg throbbing with a pain so intense she thought she might vomit. She looked up at her rescuer and finally got a clear look at his face. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with strong features, a square jaw darkened by stubble, and those intense dark eyes that seemed to see right through her. His black hair was longer than the fashion, touching his collar, and there was a thin scar running along his left cheekbone. "Thank you," Rose managed to choke out. "You saved my life." He nodded once, already examining her leg with careful hands. "Name is Samuel Stone," he said. "And you are either very brave or very foolish, running into a burning building like that." "The horses," Rose said weakly. "I could not just let them burn." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look younger. "You got 3 of them out before the beam fell. That takes courage." He glanced at her leg, and his jaw tightened. "This looks bad. We need to get you to the doctor." A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by the fire and the commotion. Rose recognized several of her neighbors, including Mrs. Henderson, the barn's owner, who was weeping over the loss of her property but thanking God that her horses had been saved. Samuel lifted Rose again, ignoring her protests that she could walk, and carried her toward Main Street where old Doc Brennan kept his office above the barber shop. The pain was making Rose dizzy, and she found herself leaning her head against Samuel's chest as he walked. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and smell the scent of leather and wood smoke and something else, something uniquely him. She had lived in Ellsworth for 2 years now, ever since she had moved here after her father's death to start fresh in a new place, and she had never seen this man before. She would have remembered him. There was something about Samuel Stone that commanded attention, a quiet strength and confidence that drew the eye. Doc Brennan was a grizzled old man with kind eyes and hands that had set more broken bones than anyone in Kansas. He took one look at Rose's leg and whistled low through his teeth. "That is going to need some work," he said. "You, Cowboy, set her on the examination table and then wait outside." "I am staying," Samuel said flatly. Doc Brennan looked like he might argue, but something in Samuel's expression made him think better of it. "Fine, but make yourself useful. Hold her hand and keep her calm. This is going to hurt." The next hour was a blur of pain so intense that Rose thought she might pass out. Her leg was badly crushed but, as Doc Brennan explained, miraculously not broken. The beam had caught her in just such a way that it had compressed the muscle and tissue without shattering the bone. She would have severe bruising, possibly permanent damage to the soft tissue, and she would need to stay off the leg for several weeks while it healed. But she would walk again, though perhaps with a limp. Through it all, Samuel stayed by her side. He held her hand while Doc Brennan cleaned and wrapped the injury, his grip firm and steady, his presence somehow making the pain more bearable. Rose found herself focusing on his face, using it as an anchor to keep from drowning in the waves of agony. He did not look away from her, did not flinch when she squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. He just stayed, solid and reliable as stone, which she supposed was fitting given his name. When Doc Brennan finally finished and Rose was lying on the examination table with her leg wrapped in clean bandages, the old doctor looked at Samuel with new respect. "You did good, getting her out of there when you did. Another minute and she would have been dead." Samuel just nodded, still holding Rose's hand. She realized suddenly that she should probably let go, that it was improper for an unmarried woman to hold hands with a strange man, but she found that she did not want to. His hand was warm and calloused from hard work, and it made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her father died. "Where are you staying, Miss Patterson?" Doc Brennan asked. "You cannot be alone tonight, not with an injury like this. You will need help getting around, help with meals and such. Rose felt a flutter of panic in her chest. "I live above my shop," she said. "I will be fine on my own. I have managed this long without help." "That was before you had a crushed leg," Doc Brennan said sternly. "You need someone to look after you for at least a few days." "I will do it," Samuel said quietly. Both Rose and Doc Brennan turned to stare at him. Rose felt her cheeks flush hot. "That would not be proper," she said. "We have only just met, and I cannot ask you to—" "You are not asking," Samuel interrupted. "I am offering, and I do not give a damn about proper. You need help, and I am here to give it." Doc Brennan stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The boy has a point, and there is Mrs. Abernathy down the street. She could chaperone, keep things respectable. She has been looking for extra work since her husband passed." Rose wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself as she always had. But the truth was that her leg hurt so badly she could barely think straight, and the idea of trying to climb the stairs to her apartment alone made her want to cry. "Why would you do this?" she asked Samuel. "You do not even know me." Samuel looked at her with those dark, penetrating eyes. "You ran into a burning building to save animals that were not even yours. You risked your life for creatures that could not thank you or repay you. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." He squeezed her hand gently. "Besides, I am new in town and could use a friend. Seems like we could help each other." So it was decided. Samuel carried Rose to her small apartment above the seamstress shop, a modest space with a sitting room, a bedroom, and a tiny kitchen. Mrs. Abernathy, a plump, cheerful widow in her 60s, arrived within the hour with a basket of food and a determination to make sure everything was handled properly. She set up a cot in the sitting room for Samuel and made it clear that she would be stopping by regularly to ensure there was no funny business. That first night was difficult. Rose's leg throbbed with a relentless ache that made sleep impossible. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she was going to manage the shop while she recovered. She had rent to pay, supplies to buy, and now medical bills on top of everything else. Her savings were thin, and losing even a few weeks of income could ruin her. She must have made some sound of distress because she heard movement in the other room, and then Samuel appeared in her doorway. "Cannot sleep?" he asked softly. "The pain," Rose admitted, "and worrying about the shop. I have orders to fill, customers depending on me." Samuel came into the room and sat in the chair beside her bed. In the lamplight, his face was all planes and shadows, handsome in a rough, unpolished way. "Tell me about the shop," he said. "What do you do?" So Rose told him. She explained how she had learned to sew from her mother, how she had a talent for it that went beyond simple mending and alterations. She created dresses for the women of Ellsworth, beautiful garments with careful stitching and thoughtful details. She also did work for the saloon girls, the women that the proper ladies of town would not acknowledge but who still needed clothes and paid well for them. She talked until her eyes grew heavy, and the last thing she remembered before sleep finally claimed her was Samuel's deep voice saying, "We will figure it out, I promise." When Rose woke the next morning, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the apartment. She called out, confused, and Mrs. Abernathy bustled into the bedroom with a breakfast tray. "That young man of yours knows his way around a kitchen," she said approvingly. "He has been up since dawn, getting things ready for you." "He is not my young man," Rose protested, but Mrs. Abernathy just gave her a knowing smile. Samuel appeared behind the older woman, looking surprisingly domestic with a dish towel slung over his shoulder. "How is the leg?" he asked. "Still attached," Rose said wryly. "That seems like a victory." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Samuel would wake early and make breakfast, then help Rose to a comfortable chair in the sitting room where she could at least work on some of her sewing projects. He proved surprisingly handy with a needle himself, which shocked her until he explained that when you spent months on cattle drives with nothing but other cowboys for company, you learned to mend your own clothes or go around in rags. Mrs. Abernathy came by 3 times a day like clockwork, making sure Rose had everything she needed and that Samuel was behaving himself. The older woman also proved to be an incurable gossip, filling Rose in on all the news from around town. Apparently, Samuel had arrived in Ellsworth only a week before the fire. He had been working at the Johnson Ranch just outside of town, one of the many drifting cowboys who moved from place to place following the work. "He is quite the mystery," Mrs. Abernathy said one afternoon while Samuel was out buying supplies. "Handsome as sin, hard-working, polite as can be, but he does not talk much about where he comes from or why he is here. The other ranch hands say he can ride better than anyone they have ever seen, and that he has a way with horses that is almost magical." Rose found herself thinking about Samuel constantly, which both thrilled and terrified her. She had been courted before, back in her hometown, but nothing had ever come of it. The boys had been pleasant enough, but none of them had made her heart race the way Samuel did. She found herself watching him when he was not looking, admiring the way his hands moved as he worked, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle manner in which he helped her move from chair to bed. About a week after the fire, Rose was sitting in her usual spot by the window, working on a dress for Mrs. Henderson, when Samuel came in from running errands. He had a strange expression on his face, something caught between amusement and exasperation. "What is it?" Rose asked, setting down her needle. "Apparently the whole town thinks we are courting," Samuel said, pulling off his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "The clerk at the general store congratulated me. The bartender at the saloon asked when he should expect a wedding announcement." Rose felt her face flame red. "Oh God, I am so sorry. Small towns, you know how they talk. I can tell people the truth, that you are just being kind, that there is nothing between us, is there not?" Samuel interrupted quietly. Rose's heart stopped. She stared at him, her mind suddenly blank. "What?" Samuel crossed the room and knelt beside her chair so that they were eye level. "I have been thinking about this all week," he said, "trying to figure out what I was feeling, if it was real or just some kind of hero foolishness because I pulled you out of that fire. But it is not that, Rose. It is you. The way you laugh at Mrs. Abernathy's terrible jokes. The way you work on your sewing with such focus and care, making sure every stitch is perfect. The way you insisted on thanking me by making me a new shirt even though you could barely sit up. I think about you all the time, and it scares the hell out of me." Rose could barely breathe. "Why does it scare you?" "Because I was not planning to stay in Ellsworth," Samuel admitted. "I never stay anywhere long. I have been drifting for 5 years now, ever since my parents died and I sold the family farm back in Missouri. I told myself I was looking for something, but the truth is I was running away from grief. And then I met you, and suddenly I want to stop running." Rose reached out with a trembling hand and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his cheekbone. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "A horse kicked me when I was 16, Samuel said, leaning into her touch. "I was too cocky, thought I could break any bronc. The horse taught me some humility." "I like it," Rose said softly. "It makes you look like a man who has lived." Samuel turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, and Rose felt the touch all the way down to her toes. "I want to court you properly," he said. "If you will have me. I know I am just a drifting cowboy with no prospects and no money to speak of, but I am a hard worker, and I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy." Rose felt tears prick her eyes. After so long alone, so long believing that she would have to make her own way in the world with no one to lean on, here was this man offering her everything she had secretly dreamed of. "Yes," she said simply. Yes, I will be courted by you, Samuel Stone. He grinned then, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and leaned forward to press his lips to hers in a gentle, careful kiss. It was Rose's first kiss, and it was perfect, sweet and tender and full of promise. When they pulled apart, she was breathless and giddy, and Samuel looked like he had just won a prize. Mrs. Abernathy, of course, was delighted when they told her. She immediately began planning, talking about proper courting procedures and how long they should wait before announcing an engagement. Rose and Samuel just looked at each other and smiled, sharing a secret understanding that they would do things in their own time, in their own way. As Rose's legs slowly healed over the following weeks, Samuel courted her with a quiet intensity that took her breath away. He brought her wildflowers picked from the prairie, sat with her in the evenings reading aloud from the newspaper, taught her to play checkers, and then pretended to be surprised when she beat him 3 games in a row. He told her stories about his life on the trail, about sleeping under the stars and driving cattle across endless miles of grassland, about the characters he had met and the places he had seen. In turn, Rose opened up to him in ways she had never done with anyone else. She told him about her mother's death from fever, about her father's slow decline after losing his wife, about the loneliness she had felt trying to make her way alone in the world. She shared her dreams for her shop, her hope to maybe one day expand, to hire other seamstresses and create something lasting. "You will do it," Samuel said with absolute conviction. "You have the skill and the drive. All you need is time." By the end of the first month, Rose could walk with a cane, hobbling around the apartment and eventually down to the shop itself. The leg had healed better than Doc Brennan had hoped, though there was still a persistent ache and a slight limp that the doctor said might be permanent. Rose found she did not care. She was alive, she could walk, and she had Samuel. Samuel had kept his job at the Johnson Ranch, working long days and then coming back to the apartment each evening to have dinner with Rose. Mrs. Abernathy had relaxed her chaperoning duties once the courtship became official, trusting them to maintain propriety on their own. Sometimes Samuel would stay late into the night, and they would sit close together on the small sofa, his arm around her shoulders, talking about everything and nothing. One evening in July, when the summer heat had finally broken and a cool breeze was blowing through the open windows, Samuel took Rose's hand and cleared his throat nervously. "I have been saving my wages," he said. "Every penny, and I have been talking to the bank about a loan. There is a piece of land for sale just outside of town, about 50 acres with a creek running through it. Good grazing land, room for horses and cattle. I want to buy it, Rose. I want to build something permanent, put down roots. But I only want to do it if you will be part of it." Rose's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Samuel, what are you saying?" He slid off the sofa and onto one knee, still holding her hand. "I am saying that I love you, Rose Patterson. I have loved you since the moment I saw you lying under that beam, brave and stubborn and refusing to give up. I want to marry you, spend the rest of my life with you, build a home and a future together. Will you marry me?" Rose did not even have to think about it. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Samuel pulled her down into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, and Rose thought that she had never been happier in her entire life. They sat together on the floor, wrapped in each other's arms, making plans and dreaming dreams until the stars came out and Mrs. Abernathy knocked on the door to make sure everything was proper. They were married in September of 1878 in the small white church at the center of Ellsworth. Rose wore a dress she had made herself, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and Samuel wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortable in its formality. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, curious to see the marriage of the brave seamstress and the mysterious cowboy who had saved her life. Mrs. Abernathy cried through the entire ceremony. Mrs. Henderson gave them a set of fine china as a wedding gift. Even the saloon girls came, sitting in the back pew and dabbing at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. Doc Brennan gave Rose away, since she had no family of her own, and he gripped her hand tightly before placing it in Samuel's, whispering that her parents would have been proud. The wedding night was spent in the apartment above the shop, which they would use until the house on their new land was finished. Samuel had already started construction with the help of some of the other ranch hands, and the frame was going up quickly. They planned to have it ready before winter set in. Rose had been nervous about the wedding night, but Samuel was patient and gentle, making her feel cherished and safe. They took their time learning each other, and when it was over, Rose lay in her husband's arms and felt a completeness she had never known before. This was what she had been missing all those years alone. Not just physical intimacy, but the deep soul connection of being truly known by another person. The next months flew by in a blur of work and happiness. Samuel spent his days building their house and working the land, breaking in a small herd of horses he had purchased with the bank loan. Rose continued to run her shop, and business was better than ever. Apparently being the talk of the town had its advantages, as more and more women came to her for dresses, wanting to be served by the woman with the romantic story. By December, the house was finished, a sturdy two-story structure with a wide front porch and large windows that let in plenty of light. Samuel carried Rose over the threshold, mindful of her leg, which still ached in cold weather, and they spent their first night in their new home making love by the fireplace and planning where to put furniture. Rose had never imagined she could be this happy. Every morning she woke up next to Samuel, and every morning she felt a swell of gratitude that he was hers. He was everything she had ever wanted in a partner. Strong but gentle, hardworking but never too busy to make her feel loved, serious but with a dry sense of humor that made her laugh. He brought her coffee in bed when her leg was bothering her, rubbed her sore muscles after long days at the sewing machine, kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world. In the spring of 1879, Rose realized she was pregnant. She told Samuel one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, and then a slow smile spread across his features, transforming his usually serious expression into something bright and joyful. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." He pulled her into his arms and held her close, and Rose could feel him trembling slightly with emotion. "I am going to be a father," he whispered against her hair. "I never thought I would have this, Rose. A home, a wife, a family. Thank you. Thank you for lifting that beam," Rose said, pulling back to look at him. "Thank you for saving my life and then giving me a reason to live it." The pregnancy was not easy. Rose suffered from terrible morning sickness in the first few months, and her leg ached constantly under the extra weight. But Samuel was attentive and patient, helping her with everything and insisting that she cut back her hours at the shop. They hired a young woman named Clara to help with the sewing, a shy girl who was grateful for the work and had a natural talent with a needle. In November of 1879, Rose gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, and there was a moment when Doc Brennan looked worried, but Rose was strong, and she pushed through the pain with Samuel holding her hand and whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Samuel actually cried, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. They named him James, after Samuel's father. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the very beginning, he was stubborn and willful and absolutely adored. Samuel proved to be a natural father, patient and loving, bouncing the baby when he cried and singing to him in a deep, slightly off-key voice that somehow always seemed to soothe. The years passed in a sweet blur of family life. The horse ranch thrived, and Samuel developed a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in Kansas. People came from miles around to buy his animals, which were known for being well-trained and gentle. Rose's shop continued to grow, and she eventually expanded to a larger location on Main Street, with Clara as her full partner in the business. In 1881, Rose gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after both her mother and her grandmother. Margaret had her father's serious dark eyes and her mother's delicate features, and she grew into a thoughtful, observant child who seemed to see everything. Samuel doted on his daughter, letting her follow him around the ranch and teaching her to ride almost before she could walk. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when money was tight, summers when drought threatened the creek that watered their land, moments of illness and injury that reminded them how fragile life could be. Rose's leg never fully healed, and there were days when the pain was so bad she could barely walk. But Samuel was always there, steady and strong, lifting her when she needed lifting, supporting her when she needed support. In 1884, they had their third and final child, another son they named Thomas. He was an easy baby, happy and content, with a sunny disposition that made everyone smile. With 3 children, the house felt full and alive, always noisy with laughter and tears and the general chaos of family life. Rose often thought back to that day in the burning barn, the moment when she thought her life was over. If she had not gone in to save those horses, if Samuel had not been passing by at just that moment, if he had not been strong enough to lift that beam, none of this would exist. Her entire world, everything that mattered, had come from that one moment of desperate courage and one man's decision to help a stranger. She said as much to Samuel one night in the summer of 1890, when they were sitting on their front porch watching the sunset. The children were inside with Mrs. Abernathy, who still came by regularly despite being well into her 70s now, and Rose and Samuel had stolen a rare moment of peace together. "Do you ever think about that day?" Rose asked, her head resting on Samuel's shoulder. "The fire. Every day," Samuel said quietly. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I even knew you. I was just passing through town, Rose. I was going to work the Johnson Ranch for a few weeks and then move on. But then I saw that barn burning, and something told me I needed to go help. And there you were." "Fate," Rose said softly. "Maybe," Samuel agreed, "or maybe just luck. Either way, I am grateful for it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Finally, Samuel spoke again. "Your leg is hurting today. I can tell by the way you are holding yourself." Rose nodded. "The old injury. It acts up sometimes, especially when a storm is coming." "I am sorry I could not be faster," Samuel said, a note of old guilt in his voice. "If I had gotten to you sooner—" "Stop," Rose interrupted firmly. She turned to look at him, cupping his face in her hands. "You saved my life, Samuel Stone. My leg aches sometimes, yes, but I am alive. I am here with you, with our children, living a life I love. That is what matters." Samuel caught her hands and pressed kisses to her palms. "I love you," he said simply, "more than anything in this world." "I love you too," Rose whispered. "My hero." He snorted softly. "I am no hero. I just did what anyone would do." "You are wrong," Rose said. "Not everyone would have run into that burning building. Not everyone would have had the strength to lift that beam. And certainly not everyone would have stayed to help a stranger recover, would have courted her and married her and built a life with her. You are a hero, Samuel. My hero." The years continued to pass, sweet and steady. James grew into a tall, serious young man who loved the ranch and had his father's way with horses. Margaret became a talented seamstress like her mother, taking over much of the work at the shop as Rose's leg made it harder for her to spend long hours on her feet. Thomas was the charmer of the family, quick with a smile and a joke, popular with everyone in town. In 1895, James married a lovely young woman named Sarah, and they built a house on the far corner of the property. In 1897, Margaret married a banker from Salina, and though she moved away, she came back to visit often with her growing family. Thomas left for college in the East, something that was becoming more common as the frontier became more settled and civilized. Samuel's hair turned gray at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes, but he was still strong and capable, still the man who had lifted that beam all those years ago. Rose's leg became more troublesome as she aged, and she relied more heavily on her cane, but she remained active and sharp, running the shop with Clara until they were both old women cackling over tea and gossip. Mrs. Abernathy passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1898, and both Rose and Samuel wept at her funeral, grateful for the role she had played in their lives. Doc Brennan followed her a year later, having lived to the impressive age of 86. The old guard of Ellsworth was fading, replaced by a new generation, but Rose and Samuel remained, constants in a changing world. In the spring of 1901, on their wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Rose with a trip. They left the ranch in James's capable hands and took the train west to Colorado, something they had always talked about but never done. They stayed in a beautiful hotel in Denver and spent their days exploring the city and their nights making love like newlyweds. On their last night, as they lay tangled together in the hotel bed, Rose traced the scar on Samuel's cheekbone and smiled. "Do you remember what I said when you proposed?" she asked. "You said yes," Samuel replied with a grin. "Multiple times." Rose laughed and swatted his shoulder. "Before that, when you first told me you were scared." Samuel's expression grew serious. "I said I was scared because I wanted to stop running." "And did you?" Rose asked. "Stop running." Samuel pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "The moment I met you, I was home," he said. "I have not wanted to run a single day since." They returned to Ellsworth and to their life, which continued its steady rhythm. Grandchildren arrived, first from James and Sarah, then from Margaret and her husband. The house that Samuel had built filled with the laughter of multiple generations, and Rose thought there was no sweeter sound in the world. Samuel officially retired from active work on the ranch in 1905, handing over the day-to-day operations to James, while he took on more of an advisory role. He spent his days puttering around the property, fixing things that did not really need fixing, and doting on his grandchildren. Rose finally closed the shop in 1906, her legs simply unable to handle the demands anymore, but she continued to sew at home, making dresses for her granddaughters and teaching them the craft. On a warm evening in June of 1908, 30 years after the fire that had brought them together, Rose and Samuel sat on their front porch watching the sunset once again. They were older now, their bodies marked by time and hard work, but their love had only deepened over the decades. Samuel held Rose's hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm, and they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. "Can you pull free?" Samuel said suddenly, and Rose turned to look at him in confusion. "What?" Samuel smiled, his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "That is what I said to you that day, when I lifted the beam. Can you pull free? Try now." "I have been thinking about those words a lot lately." "Why?" Rose asked. "Because that is what we have been doing all these years," Samuel said thoughtfully. "Pulling ourselves free from the past, from loneliness and grief and fear, building something new together. And it worked, Rose. Look at what we have created." Rose looked out at the land before them, the ranch that stretched toward the horizon, the house that stood solid and strong behind them, the life they had built together. She thought of their children and grandchildren, of the decades of love and laughter and yes, sometimes tears, that had filled their days. She thought of all the moments, big and small, that had made up their marriage. "We did good," she said softly. We did great, Samuel corrected. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Thank you for trying, for pulling free that day and every day after. Thank you for lifting the beam, Rose said, tears in her eyes. Thank you for being strong enough to hold it. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the Kansas sky in shades of orange and gold, Samuel and Rose sat together on the porch they had built, in the life they had made, surrounded by the love they had cultivated. The beam that had once crushed Rose's leg had also, in a strange way, given her everything. It had brought Samuel into her life, and together they had built something that could not be crushed or burned or broken. In 1912, Rose and Samuel celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and even 1 great-grandchild on the way. The party was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed half of Ellsworth. People came from all over to celebrate the couple who had become something of a local legend, the seamstress and the cowboy who had found love in a burning barn. During the celebration, James stood up to give a toast. He was 53 now, a respected rancher in his own right, with his father's serious demeanor and his mother's kind heart. My parents have shown me what real love looks like, he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. It is not always easy or romantic. Sometimes it is helping someone walk when their leg hurts. Sometimes it is lifting a burden that seems too heavy to bear. But it is always worth it. To Samuel and Rose Stone, the strongest couple I know. Everyone raised their glasses, and Samuel pulled Rose close, kissing her in front of everyone despite her protests that they were too old for such displays. The crowd cheered, and Rose gave up and kissed him back, not caring who saw or what they thought. That night, after the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Rose and Samuel climbed the stairs to their bedroom slowly, both of them feeling their age. Rose's leg was aching fiercely after a day on her feet, and Samuel helped her undress and get into bed before lying down beside her. He pulled her into his arms, and they lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around them. Samuel, Rose said quietly, yes, love, if you could go back to that day, knowing everything that was going to happen, would you still run into that barn? Samuel did not hesitate. Every single time, he said firmly. In every lifetime, in every version of the story, I would run into that fire to get to you. You are worth any risk, Rose. You always have been. Rose felt tears slide down her cheeks, dampening the pillow. After all these years, he could still make her cry with his words. I would run into that barn again too, she whispered, even knowing I would get hurt, because it brought me to you. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, 2 people who had beaten the odds and built something lasting and true. Outside, the Kansas wind blew across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of summer grass and wildflowers and the promise of another day in the life they had made together. The years continued their march forward, as years always do. Samuel and Rose grew older, their bodies slowing down but their minds remaining sharp. They spent their days in quiet companionship, reading together, tending the garden Rose had planted behind the house, playing with grandchildren and great-grandchildren who visited often. They took walks around the property when Rose's leg allowed it, Samuel shortening his stride to match her slower pace, his hand always ready to steady her when the ground was uneven. In the fall of 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic reached Ellsworth. It was a terrifying time, with families losing loved ones seemingly overnight. Rose and Samuel isolated themselves at the ranch, seeing only immediate family and taking every precaution Doc Brennan's successor recommended. They were both in their 60s now, at higher risk, and their children worried constantly. But they survived, as they always seemed to do, emerging from the pandemic shaken but intact. We have been through worse, Samuel said when it was finally over, and Rose had to agree. After all, they had survived fire and injury and decades of hard frontier living. A pandemic, while terrifying, was just one more challenge to overcome. The 1920s brought incredible changes. Ellsworth was no longer the rough frontier town it had been when Rose and Samuel first met. It had paved streets now, electric lights, even a few automobiles rattling down Main Street. The shop that Rose had started was still operating, run by Clara's daughter, and it remained one of the most respected businesses in town. The ranch had expanded over the years, and James had built it into one of the most successful operations in the county. Through it all, Rose and Samuel remained the heart of the family, the foundation on which everything else was built. They were the ones the grandchildren came to with their problems, the ones who offered wisdom earned through long years of living and loving. They told stories about the old days, about what it was like when Kansas was still wild and dangerous, when survival was not guaranteed and every day was an adventure. In the summer of 1926, Rose and Samuel celebrated their 48th wedding anniversary. It was a smaller affair than some of the previous celebrations, just immediate family gathered for dinner at the ranch house. But it was sweet and intimate, filled with laughter and love and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. That night, after everyone had gone home, Rose and Samuel once again found themselves on the front porch, watching the stars come out. It had become their ritual over the years, this quiet time together at the end of the day. Rose's leg was propped up on a stool, and Samuel was rubbing it gently, easing the constant ache that had been her companion for nearly 50 years. "I have been thinking," Rose said softly. "Always dangerous," Samuel teased, and she swatted at him. "I have been thinking about that day," she continued. "The fire. And I realized something. My leg has hurt every single day since that beam fell on it. Every single day for 48 years. Samuel's hands stilled on her leg, and she could feel tension enter his body. "Rose, let me finish," she said gently. "It has hurt every single day. And I would not change a thing, not one moment, because that pain brought me to you, and you have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. A home, a family, love that has sustained me through everything. The pain was the price of admission, and it was worth every ache, every twinge, every difficult step." Samuel's eyes were shining with unshed tears in the starlight. "I wish I could have saved you from the pain," he said hoarsely. "I wish I could have been faster, could have gotten to you before the beam fell." "No," Rose said firmly. She reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You saved me in every way that mattered. You lifted that beam. You got me out. And then you stayed and you built this life with me. You are the best man I have ever known, Samuel Stone. And I thank God every day that you were walking past that barn." Samuel pulled her close, and they sat together under the stars, two old people who had loved each other through decades and challenges and joys. "Can you pull free?" Samuel whispered against her hair, echoing the words he had spoken so long ago. Rose smiled and snuggled closer to him. "I already did," she whispered back. "The moment I met you, I pulled free from everything that was holding me back, and I have been free ever since." They sat together until the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew cool, two souls who had found each other against all odds and held on tight. Behind them, the house stood solid and strong, a testament to what could be built when two people worked together. Around them, the land stretched away into the darkness, marked by decades of their labor and love. As the years continued, Samuel and Rose settled into the gentle rhythm of old age. They moved more slowly, slept more often, forgot things sometimes and laughed about it together. But the love between them remained as strong as ever, perhaps even stronger, burnished by time into something precious and rare. In 1930, they celebrated their 52nd anniversary, a remarkable achievement for the time. Nearly the entire town turned out to honor them, and the mayor presented them with a special proclamation recognizing their contributions to the community. Rose cried through the entire ceremony, overcome by the outpouring of love and respect. That night, Samuel helped Rose up the stairs to their bedroom, patient and careful as always with her bad leg. They got ready for bed slowly, moving through the familiar routine they had perfected over more than 5 decades together. When they finally lay down, Samuel pulled Rose into his arms, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Samuel," she said quietly. Thank you for lifting that beam." Samuel chuckled softly, his chest rumbling under her ear. "You have thanked me for that at least 1,000 times over the years." "I know," Rose said, "but I want to make sure you hear it at least 1,000 more. Thank you for being strong enough to lift it. Thank you for telling me to try. Thank you for saving my life and then making it worth saving." Samuel tightened his arms around her. "Thank you for being brave enough to run into that fire in the first place. Thank you for trying when I told you to. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for every day we have had together." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and in memories of a lifetime spent loving each other. Outside, the Kansas wind blew gentle and warm, carrying with it the promise of another tomorrow in the life they had built. Rose passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1932, at the age of 76. She went to bed one night beside Samuel, as she had done for 54 years, and simply did not wake up. The doctor said it was her heart, that it had finally worn out after 3/4 of a century of beating. Samuel was devastated but not surprised. They had both known their time was limited, had both been preparing for the inevitable goodbye. At the funeral, he stood beside her coffin with his children and grandchildren around him, and he spoke about the woman he had loved for more than half his life. "She ran into a burning building to save horses that were not hers," he said, his voice strong despite the tears on his cheeks. "That was who Rose was, brave and selfless and stubborn as hell. And she was mine. For 54 years, she was mine, and I was hers, and I will be grateful for that until the day I die." Samuel lived for 2 more years after Rose's death, staying in the house they had built, tending the land they had worked together. He spent his days telling stories to his great-grandchildren, teaching them about their grandmother, making sure they understood what an extraordinary woman she had been. Every night he sat on the front porch in their spot, watching the sunset alone but never feeling lonely because he could still feel Rose's presence all around him. On a warm evening in June of 1934, Samuel sat on the porch as usual, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. He was 80 years old now, weathered and worn but still strong in his own way. He thought about Rose, about the life they had shared, about the moment in that burning barn when their story had begun. "Can you pull free?" he whispered into the evening air, speaking to the memory of the woman he loved. "Try now." And with those words on his lips, Samuel Stone closed his eyes for the last time, a small smile on his face, and went to find his Rose wherever she was waiting. They buried him beside her in the Ellsworth cemetery, under a headstone that read, "Samuel Stone, beloved husband, father, and hero, 1854–1934. But his children knew the truth. Samuel had never thought of himself as a hero. He had simply been a man who saw someone who needed help and refused to walk away. And from that one act of courage and compassion had grown a love story that would be told in Ellsworth for generations to come. The house they built still stands on the land outside of town, lived in now by Samuel and Rose's great-great-grandchildren. The seamstress shop on Main Street bears a plaque commemorating Rose's contribution to the town's history. And on warm summer evenings, if you sit very quietly on that front porch, some folks swear you can still feel the love of the cowboy and his wife, the man who lifted the beam and the woman who was brave enough to try. Their story became legend in Ellsworth, told and retold, embellished and celebrated. But at its heart was a simple truth, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that courage can come in many forms, and that sometimes being saved is just the beginning of the story. When Samuel had run into that burning barn in the spring of 1878, he had no idea he was running toward his entire future. When he positioned himself under that beam and felt the impossible weight of it fighting against his strength, he had no idea he was lifting the path to his destiny. When he called out those words, "Can you pull free? Try now," he had no idea he was offering not just immediate salvation but a lifetime of love and partnership and joy. And when Rose had dragged herself free from under that beam, pain screaming through her crushed leg, she had no idea she was pulling herself toward everything her heart had ever wanted. She had no idea that the strong, serious cowboy carrying her to safety would become her husband, her partner, her great love. She had no idea that from that moment of terrible pain would grow decades of happiness. But they learned together day by day, year by year. They learned what it meant to truly love someone, to build a life with them, to face hardships together and celebrate joys side by side. They learned that real love was not just the passionate moments but the quiet ones, the everyday acts of care and kindness that added up to a lifetime of devotion. And in the end, when their long story finally drew to a close, they left behind a legacy not just of children and grandchildren and the businesses and land they had built, but of love itself. They had shown everyone who knew them what was possible when two people committed themselves completely to each other. They had proved that true love existed, that it could last, that it could survive anything. In the decades after Samuel and Rose passed away, the town of Ellsworth continued to change and grow. The frontier days faded into memory, replaced by modern conveniences and new ways of life. But the story of the cowboy and the seamstress lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder of a time when the West was still wild and love could bloom in the midst of danger. Their descendants continued to thrive in Kansas and beyond, carrying within them the legacy of Samuel and Rose's love. Some became ranchers like Samuel, others became business owners like Rose. Some left Kansas to seek their fortunes elsewhere, but they all carried the story with them, the tale of how their family began in a burning barn with a crushed leg and a moment of extraordinary courage. The great-great-grandchildren who live in the old house have carefully preserved it, keeping many of the original features intact. They give tours sometimes, telling visitors about the couple who built it, about the love story that began with those words, "Can you pull free? Try now." People come from all over to hear the story, to stand on the porch where Samuel and Rose spent so many evenings, to feel the echo of a love that refused to die even when the lovers themselves had passed on. And so the story endures, a testament to the power of one moment to change everything, to the courage it takes to help a stranger, to the beauty of a love that lasts not just for a season but for a lifetime. Samuel Stone and Rose Patterson Stone lived ordinary lives in many ways, working hard, raising their family, facing the challenges that came their way. But their love was extraordinary, and it transformed not just their own lives but the lives of everyone around them. From a burning barn in 1878 to a peaceful passing in 1934, from a crushed leg and a lifted beam to 54 years of marriage, from "Can you pull free? Try now" to a lifetime spent pulling each other toward happiness. Theirs was a love story for the ages. And in Ellsworth, Kansas, on warm summer evenings when the wind blows gentle across the prairie, that story lives on, whispered in the rustling grass, felt in the solid wood of the house they built, present in the legacy of love they left behind. It was a story that began with pain and fear and a moment of desperate need. But it transformed into something beautiful and lasting and true. Samuel lifted a beam that day, yes, but in doing so he lifted Rose into a life she had never dared dream of. And Rose pulled herself free, not just from the physical trap of wood and fire, but from the loneliness and fear that had held her captive for so long. Together, they built something that could not be burned or crushed or broken. They built a love that lasted beyond death, beyond memory, beyond time itself. And that, in the end, is the true miracle of their story. Not that Samuel was strong enough to lift the beam, but that they were both brave enough to take the chance that lifting it offered.